One of the most powerful generals in American history was fired not on a battlefield, but through a quiet press release. And what if that single decision changed the entire course of the Cold War? It was April 11, 1951, and the world was about to witness something that had never happened before in modern American military history. President Harry S. Truman, a former haberdasher from Independence, Missouri, who had never attended a prestigious military academy, was preparing to relieve General Douglas MacArthur, five-star commander, hero of 2 world wars, and one of the most celebrated soldiers the United States had ever produced, of every command he held. The tension between these two men had been building for months, fed by ego, ideology, strategic disagreement, and a fundamental clash over who truly controlled American foreign policy. MacArthur was not just a general. He was a living legend, a man who had waded ashore at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines in October 1944 with cameras rolling, a man who had accepted Japan's formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. Standing tall in his crushed cap and sunglasses as if history itself had been written for him. To fire him was to detonate a political bomb inside the very heart of American democracy. But Truman had made up his mind, and there was no turning back from what was coming. The stage had been set not just by months of insubordination, but by years of a fundamental disagreement about what America's role in the world truly was, and who had the authority to define it. This was not merely a military dispute. This was a constitutional crisis dressed in military uniform, and it would test the Republic in ways few moments ever had. If you want to understand how power really works at the highest levels of command, stay right here, because this story is unlike anything they taught in school. If you enjoy deep historical narratives like this one, please subscribe to this channel, like this video, share it with someone who loves history, and drop a comment below telling us what you already knew about MacArthur before watching. Your answers always make this community richer. To understand why April 11, 1951 became one of the most dramatic days in American political history, you have to go back to June 25, 1950, the day North Korean forces, armed with Soviet weapons and backed by Joseph Stalin's quiet approval, crossed the 38th parallel in a massive, coordinated assault on South Korea. Within days, the South Korean army was in full retreat, and President Truman, without a formal declaration of war from Congress, committed American forces to the defense of the peninsula under the banner of a United Nations police action. It was a bold and controversial move, and it placed Douglas MacArthur at the center of the storm. MacArthur was already in Tokyo, serving as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, effectively ruling post-war Japan with near absolute authority. An experience that had, in the opinion of many who worked with him, inflated his already enormous sense of self-importance beyond any reasonable boundary. He was 70 years old, a man of a different era, a man who believed in total victory with a fervor that bordered on obsession. When the early weeks of the Korean War went badly, with American and South Korean forces pushed into the desperate Pusan perimeter in the southeast corner of the peninsula, MacArthur devised one of the most audacious military gambits of the 20th century, an amphibious landing at Incheon, a port on the west coast of Korea with some of the most punishing tides in the world. Military planners called it nearly impossible. MacArthur called it inevitable. On September 15, 1950, American Marines stormed ashore at Incheon, and within 2 weeks, the entire strategic situation on the peninsula had been reversed. The North Koreans were in full retreat, their supply lines cut, their army shattered. MacArthur was vindicated. He was, once again, the conquering hero, and that victory would make what came next all the more dangerous, because it convinced him that his judgment was infallible and that no one in Washington, not even the President of the United States, had the right to question it. The success at Incheon did more than rescue the war effort. It gave MacArthur a level of moral authority that he immediately began to wield with reckless confidence. With United Nations forces pushing north through the 38th parallel into North Korean territory, MacArthur spoke openly of driving all the way to the Yalu River, the boundary between North Korea and the People's Republic of China. This was not merely a tactical objective. It was a geopolitical provocation of the highest order. Chinese leader Mao Zedong had made it absolutely clear through diplomatic back channels through India's ambassador K.M. Panikkar in Beijing, and through public statements, that if American-led forces approached the Chinese border, the People's Republic would intervene. Truman and his advisors, including Secretary of State Dean Acheson and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, understood this warning with the utmost seriousness. They wanted a limited war, a restoration of the status quo before June 25th, not a crusade to reunify Korea by force. MacArthur dismissed these concerns with contempt. On October 15, 1950, Truman flew to Wake Island in the Pacific, a grueling journey for a sitting president, specifically to meet with MacArthur and ensure that they were aligned on strategy and on the danger of Chinese intervention. MacArthur told Truman confidently, even dismissively, that the chance of Chinese intervention was very small, that if China did enter the war their forces would be slaughtered, and that American troops might be home by Christmas. It was one of the most catastrophically wrong military assessments in American history. Less than 2 weeks later, on October 25, 1950, Chinese forces began crossing the Yalu River in enormous numbers, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, moving at night, hiding by day, executing one of the greatest strategic surprises of the Cold War era. By late November, they had smashed through the United Nations lines, inflicting staggering casualties and sending MacArthur's army into one of the longest retreats in American military history. The Chinese intervention in late November 1950 transformed the Korean War from a near victory into a catastrophe, and it unleashed in Douglas MacArthur something that his subordinates and critics had feared for years: a desperate, almost unhinged search for someone to blame other than himself. MacArthur began sending communiques to Washington that bordered on the insubordinate, publicly attributing the disaster to the restrictions placed on him by the Truman administration. Restrictions that prevented him from bombing Chinese supply bases across the Yalu, from blockading the Chinese coast, from using nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek. He demanded an expansion of the war. He spoke publicly and repeatedly about the necessity of striking at China directly. But Truman and his advisors, from General Omar Bradley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, to Secretary of Defense George Marshall, were resolute. This would not become a general war with China, and certainly not a war that risked drawing the Soviet Union into direct military confrontation. Bradley would later say, with devastating precision, that a war with China would be the wrong war at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. MacArthur thought this was cowardice. He said so in barely veiled terms to anyone who would listen. By December of 1950 and into January of 1951, the situation was as grim as it had been since the dark days at Pusan. Seoul, the South Korean capital, fell to communist forces for the second time on January 4, 1951. American and United Nations forces were again in retreat. MacArthur, rather than steadying the situation through command presence and discipline strategy, was increasingly consumed with fighting his political battles in Washington from his headquarters in Tokyo, a distance of roughly 900 miles from the front lines he was supposed to be commanding. The war, the men dying in it, the strategic realities on the ground, all of it seemed secondary to his crusade against the limitations placed upon him by a president he had come to regard with barely concealed disdain. By early 1951, the battlefield situation had stabilized considerably, largely due to the extraordinary leadership of General Matthew Ridgway, who had taken command of the 8th Army after General Walton Walker was killed in a Jeep accident on December 23, 1950. Ridgway was everything MacArthur was not in those terrible months: present with his troops, brutally honest about the situation, tactically innovative, and capable of restoring morale in an army that had been badly shaken. Under Ridgway's command, United Nations forces halted the Chinese advance, regrouped, and began a methodical counteroffensive through February and March of 1951 that retook Seoul on March 14th and pushed communist forces back toward the 38th parallel. The war, in other words, was being won, slowly, painfully, without the dramatic strokes MacArthur craved, but it was being won. By mid-March, the Truman administration was seriously exploring a diplomatic resolution to end the conflict near the original boundary of the 38th parallel. Secretary of State Dean Acheson was drafting a presidential statement that would invite China and North Korea to negotiate a ceasefire. This was precisely the kind of war-ending diplomacy that MacArthur despised, not total victory, not the crushing of the enemy, but a negotiated settlement that left communist forces alive and in power in North Korea. On March 24, 1951, before Truman's diplomatic statement could be issued, MacArthur sabotaged it entirely. He issued his own unauthorized communique directly to Chinese commanders, taunting them about the failure of their military forces, warning that the United Nations might decide to expand the war to China's coastal areas and interior, and offering to meet with the Chinese commander in the field to arrange a military surrender. It was not a military dispatch. It was a policy statement, one that undercut the President of the United States on the world stage, destroyed a delicate diplomatic initiative, and made the United States look fractured and ungovernable in front of every ally and every adversary watching from the outside. Truman was furious in a way that those close to him said they had rarely seen before. He later wrote in his diary that MacArthur's communique was a direct challenge to presidential authority, and that it left him no choice but to act. If Truman needed any further proof that MacArthur had crossed a line from which there was no return, it arrived on April 5, 1951, when House Minority Leader Joseph Martin, a Republican congressman from Massachusetts, who was one of MacArthur's most vocal political allies, read a letter from MacArthur aloud on the floor of the United States House of Representatives. The letter, which MacArthur had written in response to one from Martin, openly endorsed the idea of using Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese forces in a second front against Communist China, a policy position that directly contradicted official American strategy and had been explicitly rejected by the administration. MacArthur even included the line, striking in its theatrical defiance, "There is no substitute for victory." It was a calculated political message, deliberately planted in Congress by an active-duty general to build public and legislative pressure against his own commander-in-chief. In the American constitutional order, it was extraordinary. The principle of civilian control over the military, one of the foundational principles of the Republic, embedded in the Constitution in Article 2, Section 2, which designates the President as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, was being openly challenged by one of the most famous soldiers in the country. Truman consulted with his inner circle urgently. He met with Secretary of State Acheson, Secretary of Defense Marshall, and the Joint Chiefs on the evening of April 6th. The Joint Chiefs, Bradley, Army Chief of Staff General J. Lawton Collins, Air Force Chief of Staff General Hoyt Vandenberg, and Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Forrest Sherman, were unanimous. MacArthur had to be relieved. This was not just a civilian conclusion. It was a military one. The generals themselves recognized that what MacArthur was doing was incompatible with the functioning of a military chain of command. The question now was not whether, but how and when, and the answer came swiftly in the days that followed, with a speed driven as much by the fear of a leak as by the urgency of the decision itself. This is the exact midpoint of a story that has lessons for every generation. And if you're finding it as compelling as we believe you will, now is the perfect moment to subscribe to this channel so you never miss a historical deep dive like this one. Please like the video. It helps more people discover stories that matter. And share it with someone in your life who loves history or leadership. And leave us a comment right now telling us the most surprising thing you've learned so far in this video. We read every single one, and your engagement genuinely shapes what we create next. The decision to relieve MacArthur was made, but executing it required careful choreography to avoid being scooped by a press leak that could have allowed MacArthur to resign dramatically before being fired, stealing the narrative entirely. Truman gave the order to proceed on April 9, 1951. Secretary of Defense George Marshall, Army Secretary Frank Pace, and the Joint Chiefs all reviewed and approved the formal orders. The plan was to have Army Secretary Pace, who was then visiting the Korean theater, personally deliver the relief order to MacArthur before any public announcement. It was a final gesture of dignity, an attempt to give the general the news in private before the world knew. But the plan began to unravel almost immediately. On the evening of April 10th, White House Press Secretary Joseph Short received word that a Chicago Tribune reporter, the Tribune being a fiercely anti-Truman newspaper, had somehow gotten wind of the story and was about to publish it. If that happened, MacArthur would learn of his firing from a newspaper rather than from his commander-in-chief, and the administration would lose whatever control over the narrative it still possessed. Truman made the decision to accelerate. At 1 o'clock in the morning on April 11, 1951, White House Press Secretary Short telephoned reporters in Washington and told them to come to the White House immediately for a major announcement. They arrived bleary-eyed and confused to find press releases waiting for them, orders signed by the President of the United States, relieving General of the Army Douglas MacArthur of his commands, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, Commander-in-Chief of United Nations Command, Commander-in-Chief Far East, and Commanding General of the United States Army, Far East. MacArthur, still in Tokyo, learned of his dismissal not from Army Secretary Pace, whose own communications had been delayed, but reportedly from his wife Jean, who had heard it on a radio broadcast. One of the most decorated soldiers in American history had been fired by press release in the middle of the night, and the world was about to erupt. The public reaction to MacArthur's dismissal was immediate, overwhelming, and in many respects, frightening in its intensity. Across the United States, switchboards at the White House and the Congress were flooded with calls, the vast majority of them furious at Truman. Telegrams poured in by the tens of thousands. In cities across the country, Truman was burned in effigy. State legislatures in several states passed resolutions condemning the president. Republican leaders in Congress spoke of impeachment. Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin, already notorious for his reckless anti-communist accusations, called Truman's decision the result of being drunk on bourbon and Benedictine. The editorial pages of the nation's most conservative newspapers declared that a great American patriot had been stabbed in the back by a small-minded politician too afraid to pursue victory. The Gallup poll taken shortly after the dismissal showed that nearly two-thirds of the American public disapproved of Truman's decision. And then on April 19, 1951, Douglas MacArthur addressed a joint session of Congress, his first return to the United States in 14 years, and delivered what would become one of the most famous speeches in American political history. He spoke of his life of service, of his belief in victory over appeasement, of his conviction that in war there is no substitute for victory. He concluded with the lines drawn from a Baroque room ballad he had heard as a young plebe at West Point. Old soldiers never die, they just fade away. The chamber erupted. Hardened politicians wept openly. Senator Styles Bridges of New Hampshire declared it the greatest speech he had ever heard. For a moment, it seemed as if MacArthur might actually unseat Truman in the court of public opinion. And perhaps, some feared, in something more consequential than that. But history, as it often does, began to complicate the simple narrative that MacArthur's admirers had constructed around him. The United States Senate Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committees convened joint hearings beginning on May 3, 1951, to investigate both MacArthur's dismissal and the broader conduct of the Korean War. General Omar Bradley led off the testimony for the administration, and it was his statement that cut through the emotion and the theater with surgical precision. Bradley argued, before the assembled senators and a listening nation, that MacArthur's strategy, escalating the war against China, potentially triggering a global conflict, would have committed American forces to an enormous war on the Asian continent, drawn in the Soviet Union, and left Europe, the true strategic prize of the Cold War, dangerously exposed. It would, Bradley said in the phrase that would define the hearings, have been the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time and with the wrong enemy. And then, one by one, the other Joint Chiefs testified, and they all agreed with Truman. General Collins, Admiral Sherman, General Vandenberg. All of them said that MacArthur had been insubordinate, that his public communications had undermined the chain of command, and that his strategic vision, whatever its boldness, had been fundamentally at odds with the national interest. The hearings lasted 7 weeks and produced 37 volumes of testimony. And as the weeks passed, as Bradley and Marshall and the Joint Chiefs calmly and methodically laid out the facts, as the emotional wave that MacArthur had ridden began to subside, American public opinion began, slowly, grudgingly, to shift. Truman's approval rating remained low, but the constitutional argument was winning. The principle that the president commands the military, not the other way around, was being reaffirmed in the most public forum possible. Meanwhile, Douglas MacArthur himself was discovering the strange silence that follows the fall of a legend. He returned to the United States to ticker-tape parades in New York City, Washington, and other cities. Crowds of millions turning out to honor a man who had served his country in uniform for over half a century. But the political future that some had imagined for him did not materialize. MacArthur gave speeches, cultivated Republican allies, allowed his name to be floated for the 1952 presidential nomination. He delivered the keynote address at the 1952 Republican National Convention in Chicago in July of that year, and it fell flat. The delegates were restless, their attention already turning toward the real candidate they wanted. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe during World War II, a man with none of MacArthur's theatrical grandiosity and all of his genuine strategic credibility. Eisenhower won the Republican nomination on the first ballot and went on to win the presidency in November 1952 in a landslide. MacArthur, the man who had believed he could bend the Republic to his will through force of personality and public pressure, faded from political relevance with startling speed. He moved into the penthouse of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, where he would live out the rest of his days in luxurious seclusion, writing his memoirs, receiving visitors, and growing increasingly distant from the world that had once orbited around him. He died on April 5, 1964 at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, at the age of 84, outliving Truman, who had died on December 26, 1972, and outliving the controversy that had consumed them both, though never quite outliving the argument. The constitutional implications of Truman's decision reverberated through every subsequent decade of American history. What Truman had done was not merely fire a general he disagreed with. He had reaffirmed, at enormous political cost to himself, one of the fundamental principles upon which the American Republic was built, that in the United States of America, the military is subordinate to civilian authority, and no general, however famous, however beloved, however brilliant, stands above the elected president in matters of war and peace. This principle, which the founders had enshrined in the Constitution, precisely because they feared the kind of military authoritarianism they had seen in Europe, had been tested before. Lincoln had dealt with insubordinate generals during the Civil War. Roosevelt had navigated difficult relationships with his military commanders during World War II. But never had it been tested so publicly, so dramatically, and with such high stakes. The precedent set on April 11, 1951, would be cited by presidents and constitutional scholars for generations. It would inform the way civilian leaders in Washington thought about their relationships with military commanders during Vietnam, during the Gulf War, during the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. When President Barack Obama relieved General Stanley McChrystal of command in Afghanistan in June 2010 after McChrystal, and his staff made disparaging remarks about the administration in a Rolling Stone magazine article, the ghost of April 11, 1951 was explicitly invoked in newsrooms, in congressional offices, and in military academies across the country. The Truman-MacArthur crisis had become the constitutional benchmark, the defining moment against which all subsequent civil-military conflicts would be measured. Its lessons about power, authority, and the limits of military genius in a democratic republic had not aged a single day. What is perhaps most remarkable about Harry Truman in all of this is that he made his decision knowing, absolutely knowing, that it would devastate him politically. His approval rating, already battered by the grinding stalemate of the Korean War, fell to 22% in some polls after MacArthur's dismissal, among the lowest ever recorded for a sitting American president. He was mocked, threatened, vilified. The man who had made the most consequential decisions of the 20th century. The decision to use atomic weapons against Japan in August 1945. The decision to establish the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe. The decision to recognize the State of Israel in May 1948. The decision to airlift supplies into Berlin during the Soviet blockade of 1948 and 1949 was being treated by a large portion of his own country as a villain. He would not seek re-election in 1952. He retired to Independence, Missouri, living modestly on his Army pension and the income from his memoirs, watching as history slowly, methodically began the process of reassessment that would eventually elevate him to the ranks of the great American presidents. He lived long enough to see it begin, long enough to see scholars and historians start to recognize that the man who fired Douglas MacArthur had been right, constitutionally, strategically, and morally right, in a way that required real courage to be, because being right in that particular moment cost him almost everything. There are very few moments in American political history where the right decision and the popular decision were so completely, so painfully, and so publicly opposed to each other. And fewer still where a leader chose the right one anyway, fully aware of the price. The Korean War itself ground on for 2 more years after MacArthur's dismissal. Armistice negotiations began at Kaesong in July 1951 and later moved to Panmunjom, dragging through months of bitter argument over prisoner repatriation and boundary lines. The fighting continued, costly, grinding, and deeply unpopular at home, until July 27, 1953, when the Korean Armistice Agreement was finally signed at Panmunjom, ending the active combat phase of a conflict that had claimed approximately 36,000 American lives, over 100,000 South Korean military deaths, and hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties on both sides of the peninsula. The armistice established the military demarcation line very close to the original 38th parallel, almost exactly where the fighting had begun in June 1950. It was, in a strategic sense, precisely the limited outcome that Truman had sought and MacArthur had despised. The peninsula was divided. North Korea remained under communist rule. South Korea survived as a free nation, rebuilt over the following decades into one of the world's most dynamic economies and democracies, a transformation that stands as one of the quiet, forgotten vindications of the policy MacArthur had called appeasement. The war that MacArthur wanted, total war against China, the destruction of the communist regime in Pyongyang, perhaps the rollback of communist power across Asia, was never fought. And in not being fought, it avoided what Bradley and the Joint Chiefs had warned about, a catastrophic general war in Asia that could have escalated into something unimaginable in the nuclear age. Whether that avoidance was wisdom or timidity remains, even now, a subject of genuine historical debate. The story of Douglas MacArthur's dismissal and Harry Truman's courage in ordering it is ultimately a story about something more enduring than military strategy or Cold War politics. It is a story about the nature of power in a democracy, about the fact that in a republic built on constitutional principles, authority flows from the people through their elected representatives, and no individual, however brilliant or celebrated or indispensable he may believe himself to be, stands above that structure. MacArthur was not a villain. He was, in many respects, a genuinely great soldier whose record of service spans some of the most dramatic chapters of the 20th century, from the trenches of the Western Front in World War I to the jungles of the Pacific in World War II to the streets of occupied Japan. His failures were the failures of a man who had been given too much power for too long and had come to confuse his own judgment with the national interest. Truman was not a hero in the traditional sense. He was a plain, stubborn, sometimes small-minded man who had stumbled into the presidency on the death of Franklin Roosevelt in April 1945 and had been underestimated by nearly everyone around him. But in the spring of 1951, in the face of enormous public pressure, genuine political danger, and the towering presence of a legend, he did what the Constitution required and what the moment demanded. He chose the Republic over the general. He chose the principle over the popularity. And in doing so, he reminded the world, and perhaps more importantly, reminded America, that the strength of a democracy lies not in the brilliance of its heroes, but in the integrity of its institutions. That is a lesson that has not expired, and it is one that this story carries forward into every era that inherits it. If this story moved you, challenged you, or taught you something new about power, courage, and the price of doing what is right, then now is the moment to be part of this community. Please subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. Like this video to help it reach more people who deserve to hear it, and share it with someone who needs to understand what real leadership looks like under pressure. Most importantly, leave a comment below telling us, what surprised you most in this story? Was it Truman's political courage? MacArthur's insubordination? The constitutional stakes? The way history ultimately judged them both? Your voice matters here, and every comment you leave helps build something worth coming back to. The past has never been more urgent, and the stories that live inside it are waiting to be heard.